This week's reading is from the 7th chapter of Mark's Gospel, verses 24 through 37. From there Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre, and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, and the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand upon him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The word of the Lord. For several weeks this past summer in the gospel readings we've been hearing about bread. And it all started from the Gospel of John in the 6th chapter where Jesus said, "I am the bread of life." And then as he explained that further as meaning that he was the bread of life meant eating his flesh and drinking his blood, he offended more and more people until they all left. And eventually only the 12 were left, and he asked them if they too were going to go away. Peter famously said, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of life." I'm not sure Peter had any better idea than anybody else what Jesus was talking about, but at least he knew it was pointless to look anywhere else. Bread also appears in this week's passage from Mark's Gospel, in which Jesus manages to cause offense in a different way. He's traveled into Gentile territory, and he doesn't want anybody to know about it. But somebody that famous can't be concealed. And sure enough, one of the local women come to him seeking help. She was desperate for his help because she had a daughter who was possessed by a demon. She was so desperate that she fell at his feet and begged him to come with her, begged him to heal the daughter. We're used to the compassion of Jesus, so his response really shocks us. "Let the children be fed first," he says, presumably the children of Israel, "for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." He talked just like a typical first-century Jewish male, not like the Son of God. Fortunately, the woman was used to hearing language like that, and she just didn't miss a beat. She responded like a strong Jane Austen heroine and said, "Well, sir, even the dogs eat the crumbs under the children's table." Jesus immediately responded, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." We're left shaking our heads and asking ourselves, what just happened? Well, I've heard one preacher who had consulted his Greek dictionary, found out that the word for dogs was diminutive, and decided to announce to all of us that Jesus was really talking about puppies, as though somehow that changed everything. I heard another preacher say with conviction that Jesus knew all along what he was going to do, and he was just testing the woman. But somehow that doesn't seem much better. It's certainly true that the interchange was pretty typical for the first century, but still, that does little to quiet our modern sensitivities and our sensibilities that are offended by what Jesus said. We do know that Jesus had already healed a Gentile because a few chapters back in Mark's Gospel is that wonderful story about the healing of the Gerasene demoniac, the one in which the demons left, went into a herd of swine, and the swine rushed down into the sea. Some have said that the Syrophoenician woman taught Jesus that he was supposed to heal Gentiles as well, but we know that he already did that, so that could be hardly the reason for that kind of exchange. Well, the word translated food, take the children's food and throw it to the dogs, is actually the same word for bread, and that's what made me think about the connection with John's Gospel. And in Mark's Gospel, this passage is actually preceded and followed by other passages in which the disciples are confused about bread. After the feeding of the 5,000, we're told that the disciples did not understand about the loaves. And then later on, after the feeding of the 4,000, Jesus again says, "Do you not yet understand?" So within the context of the larger narrative, this Gentile Syrophoenician woman, considered to be nothing by the Jewish male disciples, knows precisely the value of this bread. She recognizes it, and she wants it. She wants it for the sake of her daughter. And if getting it means abasing herself for the sake of her daughter, she'll do it. Jesus discovers that she has more wisdom than all of his disciples, and then he rewards her for that. One might even say that her example of humbling herself prefigures the humbling of Christ on the cross. Even so, we have to be careful what lessons we draw from this passage. Those of us who are in positions of power have to be constantly aware that, like the disciples, we may have false impressions. They may not necessarily be correct. We too may not understand. We may think that we are following Jesus when in fact we're just elevating ourselves and looking down on others. Conversely, this is not a lesson to those at the bottom to embrace suffering that's caused by the powerful. The woman, after all, was asking help from Jesus, not from his disciples. She knew God's presence when she saw it, and she was asking for God's help. The passage might offend us, yet its meaning is important. Jesus responds to need wherever it may be. God's mercy is open to everyone. If we are to become more Christ-like, we too need to set aside our own judgments and our own prejudices and respect the dignity of every human being, as our baptismal covenant puts it. Treat everyone as a beloved child of God. Only in that way, only in treating people with dignity and respecting them, will we eventually grow into the full likeness of Jesus Christ. That is what God calls us to do, to extend God's love, ask for God's mercy for everyone. Amen.